I want to talk a little bit about the signs of the trigonometric functions in each quadrant. So if I take a random point that's in quadrant 1, and I'm just going to call it xy. I'm not going to give it numbers, but both of them would be positive, right? Because you'd be going right and up, so it's a positive value for both x and y. And remember that r, always positive. So I'm going to write that up here. R is always positive. Because it's talking about the radius or the length of that side of the triangle. So r is always positive, and in quadrant 1, x and y are positive. And then I also want to do this. I want to write sine, cosine, tangent, and then cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And then I want to write down what those ratios are. So this is y over r, x over r, y over x, r over y, r over x, and x over y. Okay, so in quadrant 1, both of these are positive values, right? So in quadrant 1, no matter which ratio you're doing, you're taking two of three positive numbers. So that means that every single one of those functions is going to be positive in quadrant 1. So if you look over here, this is quadrant 1, it says that every single one of the trig functions are positive and none of them are negative. Okay? If I choose a point in quadrant 2, now my x value is negative because I'm going to the left, but my y value is still positive because the point is going up. So what that means is that any of the functions that use the letter x are going to be negative in quadrant 2. So I'm going to use a light blue color for quadrant 2. Okay? Anything that has an x in it, so cosine and secant, and then also tangent and cotangent. So the only things that are positive in quadrant 2 are sine and cosecant, which is what this says right here, and then everything else is negative. Okay? So let me do this. Label that as 1. All right, so now in green, let's talk about quadrant 3. If I have a point anywhere in quadrant 3, both my x and y values are going to be negative because in order to do a point here, I'd have to go left and down to get there. So both x and y are negative. That means that anything that has an x or has a y is going to be negative. So if you look here, like this has a y, this has a y, this has an x, this has an x. Now if you look at tangent, it has a y and an x. Even though y and x are both negative, what happens is if I have a negative y divided by a negative x, that actually turns positive. So because it has two negatives, it actually turns positive. So that's why down here you see positive in quadrant 3 for tangent and cotangent because the negatives cancel each other out. And then everything else is negative because it either has one x or one y. And then finally, in quadrant 4 here, we are talking about an ordered pair. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure everything's labeled. So we have an ordered pair here. And if I label my x and y, the only thing that's going to be negative is my y value because the point would be going to the right, which is positive, but then down, which is a negative direction. So what this means is that anytime I have something with a y, that's going to be a negative value. So with this orange pen, so here's something with a y, this has a y. Cosine and secant don't have y, and then tangent also has a y. So anything with an orangish check mark next to it, those things are all going to be negative because they're going to have a negative y value in there. But then if you notice cosine and secant, they don't have the check mark next to it because they don't even use the letter y. So everything's going to be positive there. So that's why you see cosine and secant are positive in quadrant 4 and everything else is negative. All right, so the reason I'm telling you all of this is just so that you kind of understand it, but there's a way that you can hopefully remember this. And it's a little bit silly, but for some reason it's something that has stuck with me. So I'm going to put some labels here. Oops, I don't want that color. Okay, so A, S, T, C. And what those letters stand for are the functions that are positive in those quadrants. So if you can remember what's positive, then everything else is negative, right? So the A stands for all. So everything is positive in quadrant 1. The S stands for sine, and so you have to know that sine and cosecant go together. So it's only going to tell you what the main trig function is that's positive, and then you have to remember which of the reciprocal functions go with it. So this stands for sine, but then also because cosecant is the reciprocal function, you have to know that those are both positive. So sine and cosecant are positive, but everything else is negative. T stands for tangent. And then you have to know that cotangent is the reciprocal function that goes with it. So in quadrant 3, tangent and cotangent are positive, everything else is negative. And then finally in quadrant 4, the C stands for cosine. And then cosine and secant go together. So those are the two things positive in quadrant 4, everything else is negative. Now the silly part of it is how you remember the letters. So I'm going to write that, let's see. I'll write that in, I guess, this dark blue color. So the way I remember it is the words always, or I'm sorry, not always, all students take calculus. So ASTC, all students take calculus, and then you have to remember that it goes in order of the quadrants. So it starts in quadrant 1, and then it makes like a C shape and goes around to quadrant 4. All right, so what I'm going to do first is write that little chart that you should eventually have memorized. So ASTC, and remember that each of the letters stands for what is positive. So this is going to be a two-part process. So what I'm going to do is make a big chart and put these letters in. And then we have two constraints here. So we have that tangent is greater than 0, and I want to make sure this is really clear. Anytime it says it's greater than 0, we're talking about something being positive. And anytime it says it's less than 0, we're talking about that thing being negative. All right, so remember that the letters stand for what is positive in each quadrant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these things one at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out where is tangent greater than 0, or where is tangent positive. Well, everything is always positive in quadrant 1, so I'm going to highlight quadrant 1. I'm going to highlight the A, and then tangent is also positive where the T is, because that's what it stands for. So I'm narrowed down to 2 quadrants. And now I'm going to do the same thing for cosine. So I'm going to figure out where is cosine positive. Remember, everything's always positive in quadrant 1. And then cosine would also be positive where there's a C. So now I have 2 quadrants that are true for the blue thing. The answer to my problem is the quadrant where they overlap. So that would be in quadrant 1. All right, now let's do the same thing for example 2. And this one's going to be a little bit trickier, because in my first problem I had both things being positive, and now we're going to have some things being negative. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is sine. So I want to know where sine is less than 0. Less than 0 means negative. So we're going to think about this backwards. So what I want to think about is, first of all, where is sine positive? And then I'm going to highlight the other 2 quadrants. So let's think about first where sine is positive. Everything's always positive in quadrant 1, so I'm going to put a check mark there. And then sine would be positive also in quadrant 2, because that's what the S stands for. So since the 2 things where the check mark is where sine is positive, what I actually want to highlight are the other 2. So in the 3rd and 4th quadrant, sine would actually be negative. Now we're going to do the same thing for cosine. Cosine is positive, so I'm going to highlight the 2 quadrants where cosine is positive. Everything's positive in quadrant 1. And then cosine would be positive in quadrant 4, because that's where the C is. So then my answer would be the quadrant where the 2 things overlap, and that would be in quadrant 4. Oops, I don't want yellow. So I want quadrant 4 as my final answer. Same thing. This one is double tricky. So ASTC, that's always the first thing you start with. And now I have 2 functions, both of them are negative. So Sine is less than 0. That means I want to know where sine is negative. So the first thing I'm going to do before I highlight the quadrants is I want to figure out where sine is positive, and then I'm going to highlight the other two. So sine would be positive in quadrant 1, that's where everything's positive, and then also in quadrant 2 where the S is, because that's what it stands for. So what I actually want to highlight is where sine is negative. So I'm going to highlight the other two. So that's the T and the C in quadrants 3 and 4. Same deal with cosine. I want to figure out where is cosine positive first, and then we'll go backwards and highlight the other two. So cosine is positive in quadrant 1. Everything is always positive there. And then it's also positive in quadrant 4. That's where the C is. That's what it stands for. So the red check marks are where cosine is positive. So I want to highlight the other two quadrants. So that would be the S and also T. And you can see that the T, or quadrant 3, is where I highlighted twice. So that would be my final answer. So final answer for example 3 is that it's quadrant 3. Last example. So the first thing you always do is you draw your X and Y axis, and then you put in your ASTC. And now we're going to go through and figure out where I highlight twice. So the first one is cosine is greater than 0. That means positive. So everything's always positive in quadrant 1. And then cosine would be positive in quadrant 4, because that's where that's what the C stands for. And then we have to do the same thing for sine. But here's the catch. Sine is less than 0. That means negative. So we're going to do this thing where we're going to work backwards. We're going to figure out where sine is positive, and then we'll highlight the other two. So sine is positive in quadrant 1, because everything's positive in quadrant 1. And then it's also positive in quadrant 2. That's what the S stands for, is sine. So what I'm actually going to highlight are the other two quadrants. So the check marks are where sine is positive. So I'm going to highlight the other two quadrants. That's where sine would be negative. And then the quadrant where I highlighted twice is quadrant 4. So that would be my final answer.